This is NBC News Digest, sponsored by Nikon. Here is Chuck Scarborough, NBC News.
Good evening. For the upper Midwest, today was the day to start digging out from that pre-winter blizzard. The storm moved east and took a swipe at western New York. 60-mile-an-hour winds there made Lake Erie look like an angry sea. In the far west, the Portland, Oregon area, which is used to rain, got snow instead. In Seattle, a jury failed to reach a verdict on charges the Weyerhaeuser Company didn't protect its workers when Mount St. Helens blew 5.5 years ago. Now this.
The new Nikon One Touch is not only easy to use, it's so compact you can slip it in your pocket. That way you won't look like a tourist.
The National Cancer Institute reports that for the first time in 50 years, the lung cancer rate is down for white men, mainly because they've been quitting smoking. But the rate's still rising for women and remains high for black men. I'm Chuck Scarborough in New York. More news later on this NBC station.
This is NBC News Digest, sponsored by RC Cola. Here is Bob Kerr, NBC News.
Good evening. South Africa's declared state of emergency is now in its second week. 1,100 people jailed so far. The French ambassador left in protest today. In Peru, a 36-year-old was sworn in as president, with the public kept away because of rebel violence. Criminal violence in the U.S. was up slightly last year. The FBI says Gary, Indiana, Detroit, Miami, New Orleans, and Richmond, Virginia had the highest murder rates. Now this.
What to do while you're waiting for old Coke to return? You may never return to old Coke.
In Boise, Idaho, a drag racer went out of control and slammed into a concession at a suburban track. 1 dead, 20 injured. I'm Bob Kerr in Washington. More news later on this NBC station.
This is NBC News Digest. Here is Richard Valeriani, NBC News.
Good evening. Astronauts aboard the space shuttle have a green light to attempt to launch another satellite tomorrow morning. It's identical to the failed West Star satellite. NASA officials have their fingers crossed. In Vatican City, Pope John Paul made what he called a sorrowful appeal for peace in Lebanon. But he added that hope is fading for a solution that does not resort to violence. Egyptian President Mubarak arrives in Washington later this week, seeking assurances that the administration will not neglect Middle East peace efforts in this election year. And President Reagan journeys to his hometown of Dixon, Illinois tomorrow to celebrate his 73rd birthday. I'm Richard Valeriani in New York. More news later on this NBC station.
This is NBC News Digest. Here is Norma Quarles, NBC News.
Good evening. A U.S. Senate analysis of the regime of Philippine President Marcos just released says the regime fails to understand fully or to cope with the communist threat. It said the Marcos era is in its terminal stage. Hundreds of North Korean trucks have brought food into South Korea for thousands of flood victims. The Irish Navy early today seized a trawler and confiscated 7 tons of American weapons and ammunition bound for the Irish Republican Army. Officials in Dublin criticize American support for the IRA. Tropical storm Isidore is leaving the coastal area of the Carolinas, moving northeasterly away from land. I'm Norma Quarles in New York. More news later on this NBC station.
This is NBC News Digest, sponsored by Sealy Posturepedic Mattresses. Here is Jessica Savage.
Good evening. Secretary of State George Shultz returns to Washington tomorrow after more than 2 weeks away. Shultz participated in troop withdrawal negotiations shuttling all over the Middle East, and he took part in the 24-nation trade talks in Paris. In the Middle East, Shultz got Israel and Lebanon to agree in principle to a troop withdrawal plan, but then Syria said no. The Soviet news agency TASS ridiculed that agreement and charged the United States was giving, quote, lip service to peace, to which the Secretary of State then replied,
So I would call upon the Soviet Union to take another look and to get on the side of peace in Lebanon.
The Senate Foreign Relations Committee today unanimously approved a compromise plan that would give President Reagan part of the military aid he seeks for El Salvador now, with the hope of getting some more later on. The United Nations Security Council was supposed to take up a complaint by Nicaragua today, charging the United States with aggression. That meeting was abruptly postponed with no new date set. United Press International tonight says that Russian forces, along with Afghan troops, attacked the western city of Herat, killing as many as 3,000 people. And doctors in Memphis, Tennessee say that 13-month-old Brandon Hall, one of the world's youngest liver transplant recipients, has taken a turn for the worse. His condition tonight is critical. Now this.
Sleep on a Sealy Posturepedic and wake up with a feeling that really shows. What's behind the pep and pizzazz? Sealy, really.
And finally, a new comet discovered only weeks ago is now headed toward Earth. Astronomers all over the world tonight are looking skyward in hopes of getting a look at that phenomenon. I'm Jessica Savage in New York. More news later on this NBC station and NBC News overnight.
This is NBC News Digest. Here is Chuck Scarborough, NBC News.
Good evening. In his State of the Union address, President Reagan did not stop at the borders of the Union tonight as he called for a strong defense, aid to rebels in Nicaragua, Angola, and Afghanistan, and more manned exploration of space. But he also extolled the American family as a source of national renewal, and he urged an overhaul of welfare.
I'm talking about real and lasting emancipation, because the success of welfare should be judged by how many of its recipients become independent of welfare.
The president also asked for a plan to help people bear the cost of catastrophic illness. He restated his opposition to a tax hike and spoke out for school prayer and against abortion. In a taped rebuttal, several Democrats accused Mr. Reagan of being unwilling to make hard cuts, including defense, and of lowering the hopes of less affluent Americans. Now this.
3 leading toothpastes. Which gel not only fights plaque, but also cleans teeth better than the others? It's not Crest or Colgate, it's Checkup. Laboratory tests show Checkup cleans teeth better than these other toothpastes. Checkup, the plaque attacker.
NASA today said one of the Challenger's 2 main rocket boosters may have been located. NBC News correspondent Robert Bazell says it's now thought a leak from the right booster may have set off the shuttle's explosive destruct package. Israel intercepted a Libyan executive jet, but the terrorists it thought were aboard were not, and the plane was released after several hours. A bomb in a Paris bookstore injured 4 people. This followed an earlier Paris blast yesterday and the discovery of a bomb at the Eiffel Tower. Police don't know if the incidents are related. 8 people were killed in Crystal Springs, Mississippi, when an explosion caused a fire in a furniture and appliance store. And Charles Manson, serving a life sentence in the Sharon Tate mass murders, told a California parole board he might want to go to Libya or Iran. He was turned down for parole. I'm Chuck Scarborough in New York. More news later on this NBC station.
This is NBC News Digest, sponsored by Meow Mix brand cat food. Here is Edwin Newman, NBC News.
Good evening. In Grenada, American soldiers found a mass grave and possibly the body of Prime Minister Maurice Bishop. The shooting of Bishop helped to lead the United States to move in. The congressional mission to Grenada may be changing some minds. Democrats Foley of Washington and Barnes of Maryland said some of their doubts about the operation had been removed. Now this.
Hello? Hey, for $20,000, how do you say great taste in 4 letters or less? That's it, you win!
Meow Mix brand cat food tastes so good, cats ask for it by name.
With the Greyhound bus strike in its 5th day, Trailways is picking up business, running extra buses, and calling back employees on furlough. In Moscow, the annual parade through Red Square takes place tomorrow. Main interest is in whether Yuri Andropov will be there. Andropov has not been seen in public in 80 days. I'm Edwin Newman in Washington.
This is NBC News Digest. Here is Edwin Newman.
Good evening. Thousands upon thousands of Soviet workers today paraded 60 abreast across Moscow's Red Square in a May Day celebration. In Poland, riot police bowled over May Day demonstrators with jets from water cannon. The police also used tear gas and charged, clubs swinging into crowds of supporters of Lech Wałęsa and his band Solidarity Union. Secretary of the Treasury Reagan says that reducing the federal budget deficit is only 4th on President Reagan's list of economic priorities. According to Secretary Reagan, these are the top 3. Cut domestic spending, increase defense spending somewhat, and have no increases in taxes. I'm Edwin Newman in New York.
This is NBC News Digest. Here is Emery King, NBC News.
Good evening. Libyan leader Muammar Gaddafi says he'll send suicide squads to North America if President Reagan retaliates for terrorist attacks in Rome and Vienna last week. And 21 members of the Arab League have vowed to support Libya against retaliation. But Israel's Prime Minister Peres discounted the possibility of military action against Libya. He called for collective measures against nations that harbor terrorists. Now this.
The car won't start.
Before winter trouble strikes, give your gas an STP tune-up. Used regularly, STP gas treatment helps break up and remove water to prevent gas line freeze-ups.
STP is the racer's edge.
Investigators say an overloaded chemical tank caused the accident that leaked radioactive gas, killing one person at a nuclear facility in Oklahoma. I'm Emery King in Washington. More news later on this NBC station.
This is NBC News Digest. Here is Bob Kerr, NBC News.
Good evening. A deadly train wreck near Baltimore. At least 12 killed, more than 100 injured when a crowded Amtrak train collided with 3 locomotives. Tonight, some victims remain trapped in the train, which was en route from Washington, D.C. to Massachusetts. The White House doctor says 4 polyps removed from President Reagan's colon today appear non-cancerous. Mr. Reagan is scheduled for prostate surgery tomorrow, then a further cancer checkup. Now this.
Sometimes I think, Brooke, would you like him to get a little closer? And then I think, yeah, I'd like him to get a little closer. That's when I'm glad I've got Arid Extra Dry Solid. Arid fights wetness ordinary deodorant sticks can't.
In Puerto Rico, authorities now say arson did cause the New Year's Eve hotel fire that killed 96, but they found no evidence of a bomb. Bob Kerr in Washington. More news later on this NBC station.
This is NBC News Digest, sponsored by Meow Mix brand cat food. Here is Chuck Scarborough, NBC News.
Good evening. Terrorism and death in Colombia. A car bomb blew up outside the U.S. Embassy, killing a Colombian woman and wounding 8 people, according to police. The blast comes 12 days after death threats to Americans by Colombian drug traffickers. In Ethiopia, 5 gunmen holding a Somali jet with 103 people say they'll blow up the plane tomorrow morning unless 21 political prisoners in Somalia are released. Now this.
Meow Mix brand cat food tastes so good, cats ask for it by name, in perfect harmony. Meow.
State Department officials said today they hope to resume actual arms negotiations when agenda talks begin with Moscow in January. And the World Court said today it will hear Nicaragua's complaint that the U.S. is backing aggression against the Sandinista government. I'm Chuck Scarborough in New York. More news later on this NBC station.
This is NBC News Digest, sponsored by American Airlines. Here is Chuck Scarborough, NBC News.
Good evening. In Bonn, West Germany, thousands protested as the German parliament began debate on the scheduled deployment there of U.S. nuclear missiles. Police sprayed the crowd with water laced with tear gas. Nearly 200 arrested. Now today, overnight television ratings estimated 100 million Americans watched a TV movie last night on the horrors of nuclear war, one of the largest audiences in TV history. More news after this.
At American Airlines, we taught Debbie Bridges to check you in fast.
Here, let me.
But some things we didn't have to teach her.
Now smile.
In Tripoli, heavy fighting around the headquarters of PLO chief Yasser Arafat ended a 4-day truce. Arafat's asking for international help. And Americans had more money to spend last month. Personal income rose by 1.2% in October, the biggest jump in more than 2 years. I'm Chuck Scarborough in New York. More news later on this NBC station and on NBC News overnight.
This is NBC News Digest. Here is John Hart, NBC News.
Good evening. They're still looking for survivors in the ferry that capsized near a Belgian harbor. About 300 have been rescued, and 300 more may be trapped inside the ship on its side, mostly submerged. The Soviet negotiator says there's been a breakthrough in medium-range missile talks, the same word President Reagan used earlier. Assistant Defense Secretary Richard Perle says he believes the president has decided not to make an early deployment of the Star Wars system. As Lebanese factions discuss political reforms, the Prime Minister says the national crisis may be on the eve of settlement. I'm John Hart in New York. More news later on this NBC station.
In just a few moments, the baseball will be in the hand of Ron Darling. The microphones in the hands of Vin Scully and Joe Garagiola. Game 7 is coming up right after we check with Tom Brokaw and NBC News.
This is NBC News Digest. Here is Tom Brokaw, NBC News.
Good evening. A former Air Force man named Alan John Davies was arrested by the FBI in Palo Alto, California today. He was charged with trying to pass secrets to the Soviets. Moscow has been saying that President Reagan agreed in Iceland to the idea of eliminating all offensive nuclear weapons. The White House today accused the Soviets of misinterpreting Mr. Reagan's position, but refused to release the record of just what was said in Iceland. Now this. An arbitrator today blocked NFL Commissioner Pete Rozell's plan for random drug tests of all football players, saying they would violate player contracts. I'm Tom Brokaw. More news later on this NBC station.
This is NBC News Digest. Here is John Dancy, NBC News.
Good evening. Afghan guerrillas have struck back at Soviet and government troops which drove the rebels out of a key mountain pass in eastern Afghanistan over the weekend. The 60-day ceasefire in the Philippines has ended. Military units are on alert, but so far there has been no violence. Thousands of Mexican police and soldiers using helicopters are searching Sinaloa State. They're looking for 61 convicts who broke out of jail Friday night. And it's official, Calvin and Mina Dunmeyer have been married longer than anyone else in the United States, 81 years. Calvin says it wasn't luck, it was love. I'm John Dancy in Washington. More news later on this NBC station.
This is NBC News Digest. Here is Chuck Scarborough, NBC News.
Good evening. President Reagan wanted to speak to the House tomorrow before it votes on the Contra aid, but Speaker Tip O'Neill called it an unorthodox lobbying attempt and said no. After a bungled robbery, a young man continues to hold 5 people hostage in a jewelry store on Rodeo Drive in Beverly Hills. Now this.
Before you folks get any funny ideas, just want to remind you, national speed limit is still 55 miles per hour. Y'all have a nice day.
Black nationalist Winnie Mandela defied South African censorship today by telling an interviewer that the current state of emergency amounts to a declaration of war. She could get 10 years in jail for that. And a Navy court-martial has sentenced a sailor to 45 days of confinement for refusing to take a blood test for AIDS. I'm Chuck Scarborough in New York. More news later on this NBC station.
This is NBC News Digest, sponsored by Winteralls. Here is Richard Valeriani, NBC News.
Good evening. Figures out today show the main government indicators of future economic activity were up sharply for November. The 1.3% hike is the biggest gain in 9 months. In Poland, grim testimony on how a pro-Solidarity priest was murdered. Secret police defendants also told of plans to kidnap and kill other Polish priests. Now this.
Help keep your world looking warm and beautiful. Wear Winteralls. Now in control top 2.
Prime Minister Rajiv Gandhi is headed toward a landslide win in the Indian national election. At least 45 are dead and hundreds injured in violence linked to the voting. Film director Sam Peckinpah, noted for his violent westerns, died today of heart failure at age 59. His movie successes included Straw Dogs and The Wild Bunch. I'm Richard Valeriani in New York. More news later on this NBC station.
This is NBC News Digest, sponsored by Pabst Blue Ribbon Beer. Here is Norma Quarles, NBC News.
Good evening. An American woman, Linda Cancel, was shot to death in El Salvador today. The woman was traveling with her husband and her 2 children through a combat zone toward the Honduran border. The El Salvadoran government said she was shot by guerrillas. The U.S. Embassy is investigating. Now this.
Pabst is the place.
No, it's always going to taste good. That's what counts.
For the real taste of beer, Pabst is the place.
Speaking before the Southern Republican Leadership Conference in Atlanta today, President Reagan said that his administration had made America strong again. Reagan offered a vision of a new South, renouncing its Democratic Party roots. The Soviet press today denounced President Reagan's State of the Union address. The official TASS and Novosti news agency said Reagan's talk of peace was meaningless. I'm Norma Quarles in New York. More news later on this NBC station.
This is NBC News Digest. Here is Connie Chung, NBC News.
Good evening. President Reagan may unveil a new tax reform plan next week. Sources say it keeps the home mortgage deduction, drops deductions for state and local income taxes, and pegs the top tax rate at 35%. Secretary of State George Shultz said today his goal on his current Middle East trip is to form a Jordanian-Palestinian delegation for talks with Israel. Gary Dotson has appealed to Illinois Governor James Thompson to free him from prison, where he's already spent 6 years for a rape his accuser now says never happened. A clemency hearing continues tomorrow. Government figures show that AIDS cases in the U.S. have topped 10,000. Nearly half were fatal, and cases may double next year. I'm Connie Chung in New York. More news later on this NBC station.
This is NBC News Digest, sponsored by New Freedom Cinnamon Gum. Here is Richard Valeriani, NBC News.
Good evening. Muslim militiamen in Beirut today rescued Frank Regier, an American professor at the American University. He had been captive for 2 months. No one claimed responsibility for the kidnapping. The Los Angeles Times reported today that President Reagan has signed an anti-terrorism directive that permits payments of up to $500,000 for information. Now this.
Freedom's the one that took the stick out of gum and puts the fresh in your breath.
Try new Freedent Cinnamon. It freshens breath without sticking.
A strike by 17,000 workers against casino hotels in Las Vegas enters its 3rd week tomorrow. Confrontations are growing between police and strikers. There are no signs of a settlement. Almost 7,000 runners are psyching themselves up tonight for the 88th running of the Boston Marathon tomorrow. I'm Richard Valeriani in New York. More news later on this NBC station.
This is NBC News Digest, sponsored by Airborne. Here is Connie Chung, NBC News.
Good evening. A Colombian Airlines jet, Flight 11, carrying 176 passengers and crew, has crashed outside Madrid. Early reports indicate the jet was completely destroyed, although one report says 6 survivors have been found. The cause of the crash is still unknown. Now this.
The next time you're sending 2 packages to the same place, send one by Federal, the other by Airborne. See which one gets there first. Watch out, Federal. Here comes Airborne.
In London, a $3 million reward is being offered for information leading to the arrest of 6 gunmen. They broke into a warehouse and made off with more than $37 million worth of gold and diamonds. A new study shows that shoplifting has increased 10% over last year. The study also shows about 50% of all shoplifting is done by store employees. I'm Connie Chung in New York.
This is NBC News Digest. Here is Bob Kerr, NBC News.
Good evening. A deadly train wreck near Baltimore. At least 12 killed, more than 100 injured when a crowded Amtrak train collided with 3 locomotives. Tonight, some victims remain trapped in the train, which was en route from Washington, D.C. to Massachusetts. The White House doctor says 4 polyps removed from President Reagan's colon today appear non-cancerous. Mr. Reagan is scheduled for prostate surgery tomorrow, then a further cancer checkup. Now this.
Sometimes I think, Brooke, would you like him to get a little closer? And then I think, yeah, I'd like him to get a little closer. That's when I'm glad I've got Arid Extra Dry Solid. Arid fights wetness ordinary deodorant sticks can't.
In Puerto Rico, authorities now say arson did cause the New Year's Eve hotel fire that killed 96, but they found no evidence of a bomb. Bob Kerr in Washington. More news later on this NBC station.
This is NBC News Digest. Here is Chuck Scarborough, NBC News.
Good evening. Soviet leader Mikhail Gorbachev told a peace forum in Moscow today the whole world will benefit from what he called the irreversible democratization of Soviet society. He also renewed his call for the U.S. to abandon the Star Wars program. Delegates from 80 countries were in the audience, which included physicist Andrei Sakharov, who was released from internal exile less than 2 months ago. But Soviet dissident Yosef Begun, whose release was announced by a Soviet official yesterday, was still reported in jail today. Last week, Moscow said Begun was being kept in jail because he wouldn't promise to abstain from anti-state activities. Adolfo Calero, who heads the biggest contingent of Contra rebels, resigned today from the 3-man group that directs the war against the Sandinistas in Nicaragua. He denied there was any pressure by the United States or other Contra leaders to get him out. Calero added that his own army faction will continue fighting the Sandinistas.
I believe, as I've said before, that we are the only ones who have kept Fidel Castro from having breakfast in Managua, lunch in San Salvador, and dinner in Guatemala.
John Demjanjuk, who used to be an auto worker in Ohio, went on trial in Israel today on charges that he ran the gas chambers at a Nazi death camp in Poland. Demjanjuk says it's a case of mistaken identity. After losing 4 of them in accidents, the U.S. today suspended a program to put Pioneer remote-controlled spy planes on battleships. They carry cameras and radar and other detection equipment. Just last week, the Navy announced it was spending $22 million for more of them. ICE was the villain from Missouri to the mid-Atlantic coast today. Highway traffic was disrupted, power lines snapped, and at least 10 deaths were blamed on accidents and other weather-related causes. In Rome, police began the unenviable task of trying to keep traffic from the city's center. The aim is to protect Rome's famous monuments from pollution. And there might soon be another famous Aquino from the Philippines. President Corazon Aquino's 16-year-old daughter, Chris, has an offer to act in a Hollywood movie starring Chuck Norris. But she's still waiting for a presidential okay. I'm Chuck Scarborough in New York. More news later on this NBC station.
This is NBC News Digest. Here is John Hart, NBC News.
Good evening. A man in a rubber raft rowing away from a Soviet trawler that may have been a spy ship was picked up in Japanese waters, and when he asked if he wanted to defect, said yes. In the Philippines, the government count has President Marcos some 800,000 votes ahead of Mrs. Aquino, but she says 1 million of her voters were kept off the voting list in Manila alone. Now this.
Sherry, which underarm stick did you want?
Anyone. They're all the same.
No, they're not. Arid Solid is different. Unlike ordinary deodorant sticks, Arid Solid fights both odor and wetness. That's Arid's complete protection. Arid fights wetness ordinary sticks can't.
9 people arrested in an anti-abortion demonstration were on trial in Washington, D.C. today when the judge startled everybody by saying he was in the same march. Prosecutors are concerned. I'm John Hart in New York.
This is NBC News Digest, sponsored by Michelob Light. Here is Jessica Savage, NBC News.
Good evening. A White House spokesman tonight said Syria rejected Beirut airport as the site for the first meeting on Lebanese reconciliation. It feels the airport is unsafe. General Motors agreed to settle a sex and race discrimination suit for $42.5 million. That is a record amount. And now this.
Michelob Light for the winners.
I thought you were tired. Nope, just thirsty.
Michelob Light. The Reagan administration has proposed making airbags or automatic seatbelts mandatory for new cars. Critics urged immediate action. And finally, a federal report today predicted possible catastrophic warming of the Earth by the 1990s with the strong climate change. I'm Jessica Savage in New York. More news later on this NBC station.
This is NBC News Digest. Here is Chuck Scarborough, NBC News.
Good evening. Warplanes from the U.S. carriers Coral Sea and Saratoga in the Mediterranean will be conducting maneuvers off the coast of Libya for a week. The U.S. says they'll be in international airspace and no attack is planned. Philippine President Ferdinand Marcos bitterly denied he fabricated his heroic war record. His opponent, Corazon Aquino, called Marcos a chronic liar and said, "May the better woman win." Now this.
Let me get this straight. I buy a new Volkswagen GTI and they give me back up to a year's interest on my car loan? Yeah, and the Patriots are going to be in the Super Bowl.
Doctors at the University of North Carolina warn that mammograms fail to detect breast cancer more than 10% of the time and should not be relied on as a substitute for physical examination. I'm Chuck Scarborough in New York. More news later on this NBC station.
This is NBC News Digest. Here is Chuck Scarborough, NBC News.
Good evening. Veterans Day ceremonies today emphasized the recent military dead from the terrorist bomb in Beirut and the invasion of Grenada. A wreath was placed on the tomb of the unknown soldier in Arlington National Cemetery. Riot police broke up street marches in several Polish cities today, Poland's Independence Day. Jesse Jackson is the first of 8 Democratic candidates for president to have Secret Service protection. Jackson said yesterday death threats against him have increased since his candidacy. And congressional negotiators reached agreement today on a compromise spending bill to run the government. Both the House and the Senate meet tomorrow to consider that bill. I'm Chuck Scarborough in New York. More news later on this NBC station and on NBC News overnight.
Good evening. Iraq says its planes bombed 6 Iranian cities today. Iraq also claimed a major victory in the ground fighting, saying thousands of Iranian soldiers were killed. The MX missile debate moved to the House of Representatives today. Two committee votes were split, 1 for, 1 against. The full House votes next week. Now this.
I love chocolate cookies and chocolate cake and chocolate ice cream with chocolate sauce and chocolate chips, but I don't love tummy bulges, so I wear Slenderalls, pantyhose, and control top panties all in one.
President Reagan today named Trade Representative William Brock as Labor Secretary, replacing Raymond Donovan, who resigned and awaits trial on grand larceny and fraud charges. 28-year-old Libby Riddles is the first woman to win the Anchorage to Nome Alaskan Dog Sled Race. She beat 45 competitors and won $50,000. I'm Jennifer McLogan in New York. More news later on this NBC station.
This is NBC News Digest. Here is Jennifer McLogan, NBC News.
Good evening. The conviction of wealthy socialite Klaus Van Bülow for attempted murder of his heiress wife has been thrown out. A new trial has been ordered. An FBI undercover agent changed his story today at the John DeLorean drug trial. He said he was mistaken when he testified yesterday. He had destroyed some of his notes. Record cold has settled in the northern Rockies and Plain states after a blizzard paralyzed some areas with 5 feet of snow. The storm touched off 40 tornadoes, killing 16, injuring scores. In Washington, a Swedish firm has been fined $3 million for smuggling American radar parts into the Soviet Union. I'm Jennifer McLogan in New York. More news later on this NBC station.
This is NBC News Digest. Here is John Dancy, NBC News. Good evening. The Iceland Summit between President Reagan and Soviet leader Mikhail Gorbachev has collapsed. It ended with no agreement after the Soviets insisted on linking any arms control agreement to the U.S. Strategic Defense Initiative. As NBC News chief White House correspondent Chris Wallace reports, the Reagan administration is angry over the outcome.
The two leaders met for 7.5 hours, but when they emerged from Hofty House tonight, both looked grim. They had reached remarkable agreements, including one to eliminate all ballistic missiles over 10 years. But the talks broke down over the president's Star Wars defense plan. Just before leaving Iceland, Mr. Reagan explained the problem.
The Soviet Union insisted that we sign an agreement that would deny to me and to future presidents for 10 years the right to develop, test, and deploy a defense against nuclear missiles for the people of the free world. This we could not and will not do.
No, there will not be another summit in the near future that I can see at this time. The Soviets are the ones that refuse to make the deal. It shows them up for what they are.
U.S. officials say they made more progress on arms control this weekend than in the last 4 years. But as the president headed home, they wondered how much the battle over Star Wars has damaged U.S.-Soviet relations. Chris Wallace, NBC News, Reykjavik.
Secretary of State Schultz said U.S. officials were deeply disappointed. According to Schultz, Mr. Reagan and Gorbachev made progress on major cuts in long-range missiles. They were near agreement on limiting missiles in Europe and made progress on limiting underground nuclear tests. Mr. Reagan also offered to limit research and testing on Star Wars missile defense, but Gorbachev insisted on an outright ban on testing. Schultz said it was this linkage that scuttled the talks. Schultz said the president, with great reluctance, decided he simply had to refuse. I'll have more on the summit in a moment. After the talks broke down, Mikhail Gorbachev insisted he had made major concessions and said President Reagan took a stand only a madman would accept. Tonight, Mr. Reagan is on the way home from Iceland. The climb to the summit stalled. No date for a summit has been set, and there was not even a joint statement at the end. Only individual statements in which each leader tried to put his interpretation on the weekend's events. Mr. Reagan will amplify his brief departure statement tomorrow night when he addresses the nation at 8 o'clock Eastern Time. NBC News will carry his address live. I'm John Dancy in Washington. There will be more news later on this NBC station.
This is NBC News Digest. Here is John Dancy, NBC News.
Good evening. Soviet leader Mikhail Gorbachev says he hopes to sign an agreement with President Reagan to cut strategic nuclear arsenals in half. In a Washington Post interview, Gorbachev also called for superpower cooperation on an unmanned flight to Mars. Secretary of State Schultz urged the Senate today to approve a U.S.-Soviet treaty banning medium-range missiles in time for the summit. There's been a shakeup in communist-ruled Hungary. Janos Kadar has been replaced as General Secretary by Prime Minister Karoli Gross. Kadar had ruled Hungary since Soviet tanks crushed the uprising back in 1956. At the age of 57, Gross has the support of reformers. Palestinian schools reopened in East Jerusalem today, and they will begin to reopen on the West Bank tomorrow. Israel ordered the schools shut down back in February because of the Palestinian unrest. Defrocked TV evangelist Jimmy Swaggart returned to the pulpit in Baton Rouge today. Swaggart defied a one-year suspension by the Assemblies of God and was dismissed by the denomination. Swaggart's Sunday sermon was not televised. In Winnetka, Illinois, memorial services were held for the victims of a woman who shot up a classroom. An 8-year-old boy was killed and 6 other people were wounded in the incident. I'm John Dancy in New York. More news later on this NBC station.
This is NBC News Digest. Here is Richard Villariani, NBC News.
Good evening. Vietnamese forces are engaged in a major offensive against rebels in Cambodia. Today, they shot down a spotter plane from neighboring Thailand and shelled a refugee camp just inside the Thai border. Thousands of refugees fled, leaving dead and wounded. Henry Kissinger said today the present level of the U.S. effort in Central America is a recipe for failure. It was announced today that inflation in Israel has gone up again and is now running at an annual rate of 311%. Midnight tomorrow is the deadline for filing federal income tax returns. The Tax Foundation said today the average taxpayer worked 4 full months to pay federal, state, and local taxes. I'm Richard Villariani in New York. More news later on this NBC station.
This is NBC News Digest. Here is Reed Galen.
Good evening. In the Philippines, voting is about to begin. Another candidate has been murdered. That makes 81 deaths in 6 weeks of campaigning. President Reagan vows to seek continued funding for the Contras despite Nicaragua's threat to back out of proposed ceasefire negotiations with the rebels. And the Israeli Supreme Court today blocked deportation of Palestinians accused of stirring up anti-Israeli sentiment in the Gaza Strip. I'm Reed Galen, NBC News, Los Angeles.